Well, I want to open the conversation up to the folks who've come. But we welcome your questions, and I should say up front that Dr. Meyer has asked that your questions, if you don't mind, be true or false questions, just to kind of move it along here. I love when there are no questions. Look at this. Now, you know what will happen. Let me predict. That in a moment, at the end of this, when we're out of time, there's going to be 8 people at each microphone. This always happens. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Mustafa.
Yeah. Hi. In Thomas Kuhn's book, he talks about paradigms and how you can articulate paradigms through experiments. And my question is, with intelligent design, how do you articulate this particular paradigm, assuming that it is a new scientific paradigm? How do you articulate it through experiments? The reason why I ask the question is speaking to lay people, and I'm a lay person myself, I'm not a scientist. When you speak to lay people about intelligent design, you see this look on their face like you're not intelligent. But then when you speak to them...
I know that look, yeah.
But when you speak to them about evolution, no matter how mathematically impossible it may seem, you sound intelligent because there's this, sort of mechanism that we have grown to believe in as the evolutionary process, where there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for ID. So what is the testability of intelligent design?
Excellent question. I address this in great depth in both books, but first the point about mechanism. The methodological imperative of historical science is to establish a cause for events in the past. And causes may be mechanistic, they may be material, but they may be ultimately mental. They may be the result, some types of effects only arise from conscious or rational activity. If someone were to walk into the British Museum and look at the Rosetta Stone and say, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion did, we would say that person has missed something important in the causal story of those inscriptions. And so while intelligent design...
Just before you get too far ahead, so the Rosetta Stone did not just happen.
It was produced by an intelligent agent
just
as
want
opposed
to
a purely material cause. Yeah. So we're offering not a mechanism, but an alternative kind of cause. But then that raises the question of testability. How would you test that? And there are 2 aspects of every scientific theory. One aspect is explaining the facts we already have, and one is making predictions about new facts. Turns out that intelligent design does both. And much of what I've done is work on the first problem. We've got a whole suite of different types of evidences, and I show that intelligent design provides a better explanation of those already known facts than undirected material processes of various kinds. And in doing that, I use a method of reasoning that Darwin used, known as inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one that cites a cause which is known to produce the effects in question. So when we're looking at an inference to a past cause, one of the key tests is that cause... Is the test of our uniform and repeated experience in the present. Is the cause that we're citing known to produce the kind of effect that we see? A geologist, for example, in my state, Washington, out on the west coast, might go to eastern Washington, see a layer of ash, and say, how do I explain that white ash in the Palouse soil? Well, different hypotheses might be proposed. Maybe it was a flood, maybe it was an earthquake, maybe it was a volcanic eruption. Which one is best using Darwin's method? Well, it's the volcanic eruption, because what we know from our experience is that volcanoes produce that effect, whereas floods and earthquakes don't. So there's a different type of testability for historical scientific theories. Having said that, intelligent design also makes discriminating predictions. And in the epilogue to, or one of the appendices to Signature in the Cell, the first book, I lay out 10 separate predictions that ID makes that are different than the predictions that a competing evolutionary model would make. One of them we've talked about already, the prediction about the non-coding regions of the genome being functional rather than junk. So and I have a colleague, Doug Axe, who is heading up our lab, the Biologic Institute, who's doing all kinds of really interesting experimental work. So a lot of people they need to kind of take a lap around the block with us to hear about this, and then it starts to make a little more sense. Yeah.
So I'm just shocked that the Rosetta Stone didn't just happen. That's the first I've heard. What about Mount Rushmore? Because that's...
Same deal, yeah.
Really?
Wind and erosion, baby.
It's wind and erosion
made that happen.
See, it's amazing how nature plans and schemes. Yes, sir.
So if we accept your axioms and agree with an intelligent designer, I'm curious your argument as to why or if that intelligent designer is necessarily a benevolent deity versus, say, a vindictive group of aliens who are taking bets on how many antelopes are going to be eaten on the Serengeti on a random Tuesday.
Or a grad student on Andromeda. My debating partner, Michael Ruse, always says. Excellent question. Notice, though, in the way I formulated the argument scientifically, that I'm basing the inference to design based on our uniform and repeated experience in the present of those causes of which we know that are capable of producing information or irreducible complexity or circuitry or the kind of things we find in organisms. Because we know from our experience of being conscious agents, we have experience in the presence of what minds can do. But the method of reasoning that I use does not get you past the affirmation of a mind simpliciter. In other words, some kind of mind with the capacities that are similar or analogous to ours. But it does raise a second-order question that goes beyond the use of this scientific method as to the identity of the designing intelligence that might be responsible for the origin of life or the origin of animal life. And there are different possibilities. At the close of the Ben Stein film that Eric talked about, Richard Dawkins, of all people, actually speculated that perhaps there is a signature of intelligence inside the cell, but if so, he said, it must have been produced by an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, which itself evolved through strictly material processes. Ben Stein called that the ABG hypothesis, anything but God. I hold in that second-order deliberation to a theistic view, because I see evidence of design not only in the history of life, but I see it from the very beginning of the universe, built into the fabric of the universe itself in what the physicists refer to as the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and of the initial conditions of the universe. And I think whereas you might be able to invoke an immanent intelligence within the cosmos to account for the design we see in biology, clearly no being within the cosmos could account for the design we see built into the very fabric of the universe itself from the beginning. And so I think that overall, when you look at the range of evidences of design that we see, we have Jay Richards here, who's written on evidence in physics and planetary astronomy. I think that the best explanation is a theistic design hypothesis, but I would say that that's a second-order philosophical conclusion rather than something that flows out of the scientific method that I use in the books.
I normally say this in Stockton City. I forgot to say it earlier, but both questions have not been too long, but we want to limit them to about 14 syllables, if you can get the hang of that.
The questions were fine. It was the answers.
And I want no. And I want to say, well, we've been doing fine so far, but there's going to be a couple of monologues happening unless we warn against it. And yes, the question must be phrased in the form of a question. So go ahead, sir.
Do you think the so-called young earthers completely lack a scientific method, or perhaps are they just misinterpreting the facts? Because some of them seem quite intelligent.
Well, there are some very intelligent young Earth scientists, and I just happen to hold a different view on the age of the Earth and the age of the universe. There's a kind of typology here that might be helpful. Everyone who accepts they're young Earth and old Earth creationists, and both of those schools of thought like intelligent design, because if you're a creationist, there was a designer, right? But if you accept intelligent design, it doesn't follow that you necessarily affirm young Earth creationism or old Earth creationism. The question of design or apparent design is essentially an age-neutral question, and so while I don't hold the young Earth view, I can see how someone might affirm intelligent design and have a different view on the age question than I do.
Thank you. Yes.
So every once in a while, I see a triumphalist headline that says evolution has been proved in the lab. And you'll have
One more time,
right. So like in Michigan State, they went through 31,000 generations of E. coli, and then a strain emerged that could metabolize citrate. Or Plost Genetics came out with fruit flies that could fly around in levels of oxygen that would be deficient for earlier populations. Could you just articulate and clarify what is being proven and what is not being established by these experiments?
A really excellent question. There is a distinction in evolutionary biology between what's called macro and microevolution. And very oftentimes, if you make that distinction in an actual discussion, people will accuse you of using creationist terminology. But this is terminology within the discipline itself. And the short quip I cited a minute ago, natural selection explains the survival but not the arrival. It explains small-scale variation of the kind these experiments demonstrate. But it does not account for fundamental innovation in body plan, anatomical structure, and that sort of thing. So the kinds of things that are trumpeted as proof positive are very minor modifications that are typically being achieved because of variations in pre-existing genetic information. They're drawing on pre-existing sources of genetic information, whereas macroevolutionary change, the origin of whole new animals in the Cambrian period, requires huge infusions of new genetic information, and so it's really a different kind of phenomenon.
I'm not sure that we'll get to all the questions. I didn't say this earlier, but meant to as well, that we always try to end on time at Socrates in the City, just so you know that you don't have to sneak out. We will end certainly by 8:15. So, yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes, I had a question. Both Darwinist and young Earth creationists have a positive model of how life was produced. Is it within the scope of ID of ever producing a positive model? It seems like up until now it's been more of a negative criticism of why Darwinism cannot be.
Oh, I'm very glad you asked that, because the argument is often misportrayed as a fallacious argument from ignorance, if you know the informal fallacies from logic, or an argument from personal incredulity. But I discuss this objection head-on in both books. The argument for intelligent design is a positive argument based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world, not just a critique of the inadequacy of the materialistic mechanisms. I do critique those mechanisms because the argument is formulated as an inference to the best explanation. And to claim best, you have to show that the competing explanations are inadequate. But you also have to show that there is a basis in an experience for invoking another kind of cause. And so the kind of cause that is invoked to account for example, the origin of the information necessary to build the Cambrian animals is an intelligent cause, conscious and rational activity. And we invoke it because we have knowledge of what conscious and rational agents can produce. In particular, we know they can produce information, digital information in other forms, which is the crucial feature of living systems that has to be explained. So it's an argument based on our knowledge of cause and effect and our knowledge of the evidence of biological systems, not just our ignorance of an alternative to neo-Darwinism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
These questions are all very intelligent, and we could really use some dumb questions. So please, something, just keep it simple. Like, what's your wife's name or something?
I read a terrible review of your book, of all places, in National Review. And it was performed by a non-scientist neo-Darwinist who normally finds his home at the Huffington Post.
Correct.
And I had to then go and read the Discoveries Institute's response to that, which was very thorough. But I just wondered if you had any background information to how this happened to one of the most respectable conservative publications around, like National Review.
Well, people that farm books out for book review are usually doing things on cultural and political issues. And so this guy is, in fact, a hyper-partisan. He does write at John Farrell is his name. He's a good writer, but he is not a scientist. And rather than engage any of the really serious arguments of the book that we've been discussing tonight, he took issue with a single ellipsis and attempted to show that I was guilty of quote mining or taking a quotation out of context. And I had 753 scientific references in the book. And so when I first read the review, I skimmed it on the iPhone, driving home. I thought, well, not a good policy, but...
How fast were you driving?
I thought, well, I'm perfectly happy to publish an errata, and if I mischaracterize a particular scientist, it didn't really bear on the argument I was making. Yeah. But I got home and read the review carefully, and then I read the scientist, a paleontologist named John Marshall, and and I found I suddenly was incensed. I didn't get this guy wrong at all. I had a block quotation, and the first portion of the quotation was about something called the artifact hypothesis, an explanation of why the fossils are missing in the Precambrian layers. The second part was also about the artifact hypothesis, and the second quotation helpfully amplified the first, standard scholarly practice. He faulted me for not quoting another passage, and that passage he said was put the whole thing in a different context. It was about an entirely different topic, and it was entirely appropriate that I should have excised it, as it was about the duration of the Cambrian explosion, a different technical matter. So it was really a poor review, especially poor because it didn't address the main arguments of the book, and I would have welcomed spirited or thoughtful criticism of those. It just didn't come.
Actually, to throw my own 2 cents in on that, asking why would a wonderful magazine like National Review do something like that? And by the way, Rich Lowry is often here. Is he here? No. The editor of National Review, maybe could, is Marshall McLuhan in the audience? He can answer that. But I think oftentimes what happens, and this is why I'm interested in this on one level, is that it's a cultural debate. It's not just a scientific debate. And there are many people that would say, well, I'm a conservative, but I'm not that kind of a conservative.
Yeah.
You don't think I believe in that stuff. And I think that there are probably many people, whether they think of themselves as libertarians or, particularly sophisticated conservatives, they would dismiss anything that is, let's say, social conservatism or any conservatism that, or any view that would invoke a deity. They're just uncomfortable, and so I'm not so surprised. I'm dismayed, but I'm not so surprised that National Review would have published it.
Let me defend National Review a little bit, because I got an email just before we came over for the event from another an NRO writer who's going to do a piece on the book. He's very excited about it. So they'll be teaching the controversy, as we say, within the pages of NR, which is a great policy on things like this. But I also want to speak to the social anxiety that surrounds this issue. There is this stigma and stereotype that anyone who's questioning Darwinism is doing so. In fact, this is the dominant narrative. That when Darwin came along, it was after centuries of people believing in a divine creator. Then there was this overwhelming scientific evidence that overthrew that idea. And anyone who questions Darwin now is doing so because they're an insecure religious fundamentalist. And one of the things I try to do in the book is show there is a really interesting scientific basis for the dissenting opinion that is now bubbling up all over the place in the scientific community, and that narrative is just simply, if it was ever true, it's no longer true. And the social, it's the image of the white-shoed Bible thumper from a very rural place who drools, Right. And
careful, because there are two in the back.
Yeah.
But they always show up. They're wonderful people.
But
you just don't want to get too close to home.
Very, very scientifically sophisticated and dissent, and it needs to be heard as part of the discussion. The other thing I'd say is that I think many of the policy and cultural magazines, they sense but don't entirely recognize why this issue is important to everything else they care about. The Wall Street Journal had a great cartoon a little while ago in their Salt and Pepper cartoon, that they do on the op-ed page, and it was a hapless guy before a judge, and he says, "Not guilty by reason of millions of years of evolutionary selection for aggressive behavior, Your Honor." And it's a funny cartoon, but actually I went back and looked at this. The first instance of what's called the diminished responsibility plea, I did it because I was insane, was actually made by Clarence Darrow in 1924 in the famous Leopold and Loeb case, the thriller murder case. Two young University of Chicago college students killed a 12-year-old boy for the thrill of it, to show their independence from bourgeois morality. And they were convicted. At the point of sentencing, the ACLU sent out Darrow, and he argued that, yes, they did have defective moral machinery, but they had such defective moral machinery because they were the product of an unguided, undirected, mindless evolutionary process. Not Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it,
Right.
but Flip Wilson,
Right.
my evolutionary history did.
I just can't tell you how I love the fact that you referenced Flip Wilson. That's just, you've made my night. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Could everything have been designed into what I'll call the primordial soup, where all the radiation, even the Cambrian explosion, could have been programmed
Front-end loaded.
Front-end loaded,
Right.
the way that, a 1 or 2 cell embryo can radiate into a very complicated, organism.
Excellent question. I'll try to be brief since we're running out of time, but that's entirely a matter of the empirical data. It could be either, and there are proponents of intelligent design who think everything was front-end loaded at the beginning of the universe, others who see it at the beginning of life. I actually hold the view that there were multiple infusions of new information along the way. There's, in the interest of time, there is a video, the under 30s at our office who are tech whizzes have created a YouTube channel of videos, and there's one on this very question: could the design that we see in evidence have been front-end loaded? Could you explain the origin of life from the fine-tuning of the laws of physics at the very beginning. I think there's a good scientific reason that you couldn't. There's not enough information in that fine-tuning to account for the information you need to build a cell. And so I think we're looking at multiple infusions of information, if you will. But to explain why would take a little more time than we have tonight, but I'd refer you to that video. It's a great question. And it is an open question for people who are open to considering design. It's not a one-size-fit-all. There's different models of intelligent design that scientists are developing.
Many people right now are looking into the works of Alvin Plantinga as a philosopher of science, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you have a PhD,
I know Al well,
right?
Yeah,
in
yeah.
philosophy of science. And many people seem to have this view that you and him are kind of like antithetical, you know? In some ways of like either because he believes in like guided evolution and, you know, all that.
Let me clarify his position because we just had Al out to the office. I've known him since the 80s, and he's been really a friend of the ID movement. His main work in the philosophy of science has been challenging this principle known as methodological naturalism that says that scientists must limit themselves to materialistic explanations even if they're looking at the Rosetta Stone or digital information in DNA. And he says, no, there's no presumption of a materialistic explanation. We need to be open to all explanations. He's making on evolution a much more narrow logical point that randomness might be, what we look at as randomness might be, there might be a hidden hand behind it. And so he's also deeply skeptical about the scientific evidence for neo-Darwinism. So I think there are very few differences actually between Plantinga and most of the leaders in the ID movement. There have been some interesting discussions about this issue of randomness. Jay Richards, my colleague, has had some very good online discussions with Al on these questions. I'd refer you to those. There are some slight differences in opinion about the extent to which Darwinism is inherently committed to a materialistic approach and the extent to which it might be harmonizable, if you will, with some sort of guidance. But if there is guidance to the mechanism, that would be a form of intelligent design.
Yeah. So my question was, is there any difference between you? And if not, which you have said that, like, it is, what is it, or is it, you know?
Yeah, the difference, and we had a really good discussion about this, and so we're all learning from each other on it. But I think the main difference would be the extent to which the mechanism of natural selection and random variation could be understood to be a teleological process, could be guided. Okay, and I think if it is guided, then it's certainly a mode of intelligent design. Just as there are young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists who are proponents of intelligent design, there are theistic evolutionists who would also wear that moniker. There's a common view. If there's a mind involved as a causal agent, that's intelligent design, whether it's gradual or episodic. But there's a technical point about Darwinism. Is the mechanism of natural selection inherently an unguided mechanism? I think it's built into the logic of the argument that Darwin makes in the 3rd chapter of The Origin that it's an inherently unguided mechanism because he sets up natural selection in opposition to artificial selection, intelligent selection, and says, look, nature can do what the breeder can do. And, but I do acknowledge that you could have you could conceive of something that looks unguided that might have a mind behind it. But the real crucial question is that appearance of design that we actually see in the evidence. And if you acknowledge that appearance is the result of actual design, then you're in the ID camp, whether you say, well, God was guiding something or it was more episodic or a creation by fiat. So I think the differences on that level are, they're really fine points of logic about what is Darwin saying.
Thank you.
Dr. Meyer, with the advances in research and the seeming cultural acceptance that's growing around intelligent design, do you see it being taught in schools, at the very least, even alongside a theory with evolution sometime in the near future?
Well, it is being discussed with various degrees of openness and or suppression at the university level. There is a case right now in Ball State University in Indiana. There are 2 prominent ID proponents in the astronomy department there. One, Jay Richards' co-author, Guillermo Gonzalez, and the other astronomer there, Eric Hedin, has been the subject of a kind of secular witch hunt, really. The Freedom from Religion Foundation started pressuring the university to shut down a course he was doing on the boundaries of science because he had 2 books that were discussing intelligent design, one pro, one con. which I think is just absurd. But many college professors are discussing these issues, both in science classes and in philosophy of science classes, and thereby exercising their academic freedom. At the level of the high school curriculum battles where this comes up, I think it would be constitutionally permissible. I think intelligent design is a scientific theory that has larger worldview or metaphysical implications, and I think Darwinism is a scientific theory that has competing metaphysical and worldview implications. So teaching them side by side, teaching about these theories without trying to indoctrinate students, I think should be constitutionally permissible. However, I think it's imprudent for our side right now to be trying to push intelligent design into the public school textbook battles, because there's such confusion about church-state jurisprudence that inevitably a sensible policy is going to kick this up into the courts. And for us, we want our scientists working on the science right now. We're trying to prosecute this argument at the highest levels of the academy, instead of getting drawn into cases like Dover, where you had the absurdity of a federal judge trying to decide the definitional question of what is science, which is properly within the provenance of the philosophy of science. So right now, we think it's imprudent to try to force intelligent design into the schools. When the Dover trial was in the news, 2005, there had been one peer-reviewed article in mainstream science journals advocating the theory of intelligent design. It was that new. Now we're approaching 100. And at some point, the trickle becomes a rivulet, becomes a stream, becomes a gush. And there are just too many scientists doing science from this perspective to keep it out of the educational system. Students are going to want to know, they're going to ask their teachers, teachers are going to want to talk about it. So I'd prefer to let it happen organically than to have a big policy push. That's been our position.
Okay, we've got time for 2 very brief questions and 2 brief answers, so go ahead.
I've seen a lot of discussions with scientists on the evolutionary side where they can almost come to grips with the idea of intelligent design, but they define away intelligence to make it seem mechanistic. Is there a difference? I mean, is it really the word personal that throws them for a loop? Is there a difference?
Well, there you get into some very deep questions in the philosophy of mind, and I accept consciousness as another interesting figure in this discussion is Thomas Nagel, who's written a book, Mind and Cosmos, subtitle with Oxford Press last fall, how the neo-Darwinian materialist view of reality is almost certainly false. And one of the things that Nagel is arguing is that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the world. Minds are fundamental features of the world. They can't be reduced or explained away by the movement of molecules in synapses. And I think that we know of our conscious minds by direct introspective experience. And I actually think we know of that better than we know of any conclusion that is rendered to us from science, because all scientific conclusions are mediated to us by the senses and through scientific authorities. And so any scientific theory that removes consciousness and mind as a reality, in other words, that it's so reductive and materialistic that it eliminates what we know best, which is our own reality as conscious agents, is a self-contradictory form of scientism. And so for me, any notion of mind which is fundamentally reduced to just an epiphenomenon of matter is actually an incoherent view. Now, I've been asked, could you be a physicalist about mind and advocate intelligent design? I think that is a possible position, but I think it's ultimately incoherent because I reject the physicalist account of the mind-body problem.
Thank you. The final question. I have to say, I didn't even know there was such a word as physicalist. I really didn't. Thank you.
It's simply the idea that the mind is reducible to molecules.
Actually, how's physicalist different from materialist?
Very similar.
Very similar.
Physicalism is the expression of materialism in the philosophy of mind or cognitive science.
Okay.
As Christians, the basis of our faith is based on the belief in the possibility of the supernatural, from the resurrection of Christ to the virgin birth. And the only place where that notion of the supernatural has a problem is in the cosmopolitan West, not in the rest of the world, per se. And could an argument be made with respect to why does the scientific community reject even the possibility of the supernatural as an explanation for things when they recognize, for example, that there was a paradigm that we had with Newtonian physics that was upset by Einstein, where everything changed with that. Why isn't there an ability to recognize that there might be paradigms that they're not taking into account, again, showing complexity or things they've not taken into account that might bring in what we would call the supernatural, things beyond our understanding? Why is that unscientific to even explore that possibility when the evidence...
That's a really great and thoughtful question. And there's a long story, of course, and it's the story of the establishment of scientific materialism as the dominant philosophy associated with science. Much of that occurred in the late 19th century. You had Darwin giving a materialist account of origins. You had Marx with a utopian materialistic, dialectical materialist vision of the future. You had Freud giving a materialist account of human nature. Skinner, other major figures. So we have, in a sense, we're working off the intellectual capital of the late 19th century, and it's still with us, and it is cracking up and it's dissipating. I think many modern scientists, some simply are operating in that stream in a very conventional way, but others are thoughtful about it and will argue that we need the materialist methodology to make progress in science. And I think here we advocates of intelligent design, bear a burden of demonstration to show that looking at life in a non-materialistic way as a design system can bear fruit in science. I think it can, I think it already is, and I think the history of science, interestingly, has already shown that. If you go back to the scientific revolution, to Kepler and Newton and Boyle and Galileo, these early founders of modern science were operating out of an explicitly theistic framework. Newton always gets tagged as being the author of the great mechanistic universe, but his understanding of gravity was profoundly anti-materialistic. This is the fundamental law for Newton, was gravitation. He thought it was absolutely mysterious that there would be action at a distance, that there would be a force transmitted through empty space from the Earth to the Moon, for example. And in the end, he thought that gravity was only explained as an expression of God's, quote, constant spirit action. So the theistic view of reality that gave rise to modern science in the period we call the scientific revolution was incredibly fruitful, and I think it can be and is already, again, if we think of design as essentially a theistic-friendly construct, I think that it will be heuristically fruitful and already is proving to be so. But I do take seriously the objection of our materialist colleagues who want to see the proof in the pudding.
Thank you very much. You know, heuristically, that's the magic word of the evening. Thank you very much. I tell you, we could go on and on. This is delightful. Thank you for coming. I'm trying to think what we have to say. First of all, in just a moment, somebody's going to whisk a table or something, I think, up here. Does anybody know where the book signing is happening? Is there a table there already? Okay. So if those of you who are interested in having Dr. Meyer sign your book or the book that you're about to purchase, and please do.
And Eric.
Thank you. So thank you for coming.